One of the age-old debates of Star Wars ever since the prequel trilogy wrapped up is whether the Imperial-class Star Destroyer or the Venator-class Star Destroyer is better. Now, I'm not going to directly answer that today, but I'm going to talk about why I don't agree with the idea that the Venator should have been kept in use over the Imperial-class Star Destroyer as the main ship of the Empire, and why both ships kind of worked for what they were doing, to a large extent. The specific reasons why the Venator would be a better replacement for the Imperial tend to vary as much as there are different people who have the opinion, so I'm not going to try to represent every aspect of it, but generally it boils down to the idea that the Venator was able to carry a lot more starfighters and would therefore have been better equipped to fight the rebellion, which was so starfighter reliant. But I feel like there's a few key facts that this misses out on. First, let's break down the basic armaments of both ships. The Venator was armed primarily with 8 dual heavy turbo laser turrets, which are the ones that you can see kind of lining the superstructure on the ship's top, the dorsal surface. There were also a couple proton torpedo tubes, dozens of laser cannons, and a couple of medium dual turbo laser turrets that aren't quite as heavy gauge as the ones lining the superstructure. This was all packed onto a frame that was 1,137 meters long. Now, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer was somewhat more heavily armed than the Venator. It was 1,600 meters long, so there was quite a bit more space to have those weapons on and for a reactor to power those weapons, though it is important to remember that length only tells you so much. Volume is a lot more important when talking about spaceships, but the shapes are similar enough that there's not a huge amount lost in the comparison there. The ISD had about 60 heavy turbo lasers, 60 ion cannons, and then depending on whether it is the ISD-1 or ISD-2, there were some main turrets that were kind of lining these superstructures similar to the Venator. On the ISD-2, these were octuple barbette turbo lasers. On the ISD-1, these were 6 heavy dual turbo laser turrets, and then usually also 2 dual ion cannons. Both the ISD-1 and the ISD-2 did have some other weaponry present, sometimes being point defense lasers or other turbo lasers of smaller gauge or ion cannons, but the main weaponry is kind of the stuff that we've mentioned already, and that is enough for the point of today's comparison. So clearly the ISD-1 and ISD-2 are better at capital ship combat than the Venator was, and this is something that's kind of important for the roles they play within the context of the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War, or the Empire as an entity that kind of had to police the entire galaxy. Again, the usual advantage that the Venator is given over the Imperial class is that it was able to field sometimes 400 or more starfighters, but there are some specific pieces of context here that make that less valuable than it may seem at first glance. Now, keep in mind that not always is there going to be a full complement on the ships. The Venator, while it did see service into the Imperial period, was primarily designed to exist in a kind of total war situation, where there was pitched battles between large Separatist and Republic fleets. So even if you did assume that the ship was always stocked up full, this would be far less valuable during the Imperial period than during the Separatist period. Even with the fact that the Rebels relied so heavily on starfighters, you rarely needed a vast swarm of TIE fighters to take them down. They did rely on numbers over quality, but there was still only so many Rebel starfighters to go along with. And usually the value of the Imperial class would be that it would stop descent by just how imposing it was. If you were to keep the Venator, there were still capital ships out there that could compete with the Venator, whether they were holdovers from the CIS that had found their way into Rebel hands, or the later Mon Calamari ships. These were all things that could go toe-to-toe with the Venator, so it was something that the Rebels would feel like they could challenge, whereas the ISD was kind of the most powerful thing available in the galaxy at the time, or at least the most commonly powerful thing available. While the Venator is typically noted as having all this extra space for fighters available, another thing to keep in mind is the logistics of having that many fighters around. This was again something that would be valuable during the Clone Wars, where they were leaving their home bases for specific engagements and then often coming back or having supply lines set up that made it reasonable over the 3-year Clone Wars to have this kind of scale of starfighter combat, even if it was again rare that you'd see that many starfighters actually coming out of a Venator. With the ISD, while it is larger and carries fewer starfighters, the ship itself was meant to act as almost a whole system or sector control force, so they would be sent out to function on their own for months or even years at a time and be able to lock down an area on their own, and this would imply that they were carrying a lot of supplies. This would include not just their own starfighters and things to supply them, but also entire ground bases and armies to go along with them, something that the Venator wasn't really concerned about and tended to be shifted more towards the Acclamator. You could technically convert some of that storage space to more fighters, and you'd probably be able to compete with the Venator in terms of raw numbers if that was what you really wanted to do, but it wasn't something that the Empire was necessarily concerned about. They needed to make sure they were the biggest kids on the block and that they were primarily stopping any dissent from happening. The biggest fright for the Empire was making sure that no fight happened at all, and this was something that the ISD would be able to do that the Venator wouldn't really be able to do to the same extent. Again, they are something that still makes up a decent portion of the Imperial fleet they saw used throughout the Imperial period, but when you're talking about one ship to identify with Imperial power, the Venator wasn't quite up to the standards that the ISD was in these categories. I think when you're talking about making two kind of opposing pitched battles, there's a definite discussion to be had over whether the power of the kind that the Venator had versus the power of the kind that the ISD had was more valuable, but this often leaves out the context in which these fleets were tending to operate and the doctrines that they were operating under. When you get to later pitched engagements between the New Republic and the Empire with these kind of preset forces and operational bases, that gets a bit more like the Clone Wars, though more limited in scale because the galaxy's been at war for so long, then there's a definite value to the kind of power the Venator was bringing to the table. This is actually evident in the way the New Republic tended to structure their military, going away from the long-range, isolated ships that were able to operate on their own and police a system, back to the more single-purpose, task force-oriented ships like the Nebula and the Endurance, which is arguably a spiritual successor to the Venator and fits a lot of the same descriptions and capabilities that the Venator did. Either way, those are my thoughts on the subject. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments, and also let me know whether you prefer the Venator or the ISD. Despite what I've just been talking about, I do prefer the Venator as a ship. I think it looks cooler, I think its role is cooler, but let me know what you think. If you have any other subjects you'd like to see me cover on the channel, leave those in the comments as well, and if you have enjoyed, consider leaving a like or subscribing for more. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.